In 2015, 6 years before the start of the current military conflict, the Russian military hacked into Ukraine's critical infrastructure. This started a chain reaction that could have collapsed their entire grid.
Russia appears to have figured out how to crash a power grid with a click.
The Ukrainians were lucky. They got their power back online in a few hours. If the same attack were launched on the US grid, because they're more sophisticated, experts say it would take days or weeks for the power to come back online. 7 years after that attack in 2015, in the early days of the current war, Sandworm, a cyber espionage unit of Russia's military, shut down 9 electric substations. The group was on its way to bringing down the entire grid before they were stopped. Both the 2015 and 2022 attacks used the same tactics and had the same results. Ukrainians had 7 years to fortify critical infrastructure against a known adversary, but they didn't. So the question has to be asked, are we prepared for similar attacks?
In terms of preparedness, really, no one is prepared for a dedicated onslaught from one of the best cyber actors out there, the Russian intelligence services. They have 3 main intelligence services that are conducting cyber operations. The GRU, which is one of the most well-known, is their military intelligence agency. They were the ones that have conducted so many destructive attacks in the past, including taking down Ukrainian networks, as well as their power grid back in 2015 and 2016.
And Russia isn't the only foreign nation that might want to strike our grid. As we already know, Texas has its own grid, so we're uniquely positioned to protect our citizens from attack. But year after year, lawmakers refuse to act. Making matters worse, key components of our grid are supplied by a foreign adversary, parts that could potentially be sabotaged remotely. In this episode, we'll delve into the known threats lurking in our electric grid, propose solutions to protect Texans, and who's to blame for inaction. From Texas Scorecard, I'm Daniel Greer, and this is Exposed. Lights out.
If it weren't for renewable energy subsidies, there wouldn't be a single wind turbine in Texas. There wouldn't be a single solar panel. They are so uneconomical.
The whole thing is about charging us more money. The whole thing is about controlling our life and our behaviors. And in terms of the environment, it makes absolutely almost no difference whatsoever.
When you talk about the fragility of our grid, for example, there are 16 or 17 substations that if compromised, our whole grid goes down.
I started seeing the tentacles of China wrapping themselves around countries and strangling them.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Assistant Secretary Evans, I wanted to touch on EMPs. The Commission to Assess the Threat from Electromagnetic Pulse Attack has warned that a high-altitude EMP would be they quote, an existential threat to the survival of the United States and its allies.
If a foreign adversary, such as China, Iran, North Korea, or Russia, were to detonate an EMP over the center of our country, 9 out of 10 Americans would die within a year. That's according to Dr. William Graham, the chair of the EMP Threat Commission. EMP stands for Electromagnetic Pulse. Here's Texas State Senator Bob Hall, a specialist on the Texas grid and EMP warfare, to quickly explain how an EMP would work its destruction.
Well, an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, that is something that is created by detonating a small nuclear weapon outside the atmosphere of the Earth, roughly 200 to 250 nautical miles above the surface of the Earth. If you were to detonate one nuclear weapon about in that location above roughly Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, somewhere central part of the United States, the gamma rays from the detonated weapon would impact the atmosphere, knocking electrons loose that would interact with the Earth's magnetic field, creating huge, several thousand volts of electricity that would affect anything electrical or electronic, overload it and burn it up. Very few things would survive, including large transformers and all the way down to small devices like telephones. It would be devastating. Nothing electrical would survive, and we would be thrust back into roughly the 1800s.
And while all this may sound like some Cold War era scare tactics, the US is at this moment fighting a proxy war with Russia, according to many geopolitical analysts.
Why is NATO doing things? I mean, Katie, if you and I were having this conversation 3 years ago before the Russian invasion, and we talked about the fact that there was a possible scenario where NATO would be engaged against Russia in a proxy war like this, and they'd be providing, sort of the ability of the Ukrainians to launch weapons directly into Russia, that the Americans, the Europeans would all be in favor of that, you'd say not only is that crazy, you'd say it's incredibly dangerous, and yet that's where we are.
And things are not just going badly when it comes to US-Russian relations. The US is meaningfully crossways with China, North Korea, and Iran, all countries Russia has shared EMP technology with. Again, here's Senator Hall.
Except other countries acquired the capability due to the help from the Russians and the theft by the Chinese, and then they passed it on to others like North Korea and Iran, so that now it's well known. All those countries have warned us or threatened us with an EMP attack. You can go look up Kim Jong-un, and he has said that in multiple speeches he's given. And the North Koreans now own 3 satellites that are on a south polar orbit, circling over the United States multiple times a day. 3 of them that have never sent back a signal. We've monitored them. That means that either they were complete duds or they contain a nuclear weapon just waiting for a signal to be dropped. We don't know the answer.
If the specter of North Korean satellites circling the globe is not alarming enough, there have been foiled attempts to position weapons capable of launching an EMP attack right off our shores.
We do know that in 2013, we intercepted a cargo ship going through the Panama Canal that had 2 SA-2 missiles on it, buried under about 10,000 tons of sugar and all the launch control equipment. Because one of the most popular theories of how an attack could be made easily is to use a medium-range missile like a SA-2 to launch a nuclear weapon off the deck of that ship, sitting off the coast of Galveston or San Diego or Charleston, South Carolina, or all 3. One missile, one small weapon, gets to 250 nautical miles above Kansas area in general, set off, and you have an EMP attack.
With the current state of geopolitics, the threat of an EMP being deployed is maybe greater now than ever before. And restraint may not be the name of the game. Dr. Peter Vincent Pry is the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. He's an expert in EMP warfare and was a member of the EMP Commission. Here's what he has to say.
When we think of nuclear weapons in the United States, we think, well, North Korea would never cross the nuclear line, because for us, that's a big, deep, dark red line that we would very reluctantly cross. But North Koreans don't think that way about EMP, nor does Russia or China or Iran. In their military doctrine, EMP is part of a cyber warfare. It's part of a combined armed cyber warfare campaign.
Given these known threats, is Texas moving to harden infrastructure assets? Hardening is a term that broadly means improving the performance of our electric grid to ensure it can withstand and recover from physical and cyber threats. Hardening can be as simple as keeping power lines clear of debris, swapping out parts, or installing code that takes systems offline before an attack so they can be rebooted after. Senator Hall has authored multiple proposals to start the process of hardening the Texas grid in the Senate, but these efforts have been killed in the Texas House.
Only the Senate, we managed to get the bill to do something about it out of the Senate. Every session I've been in there, it dies in the House, and it gets no support from the governor's office.
What's frustrating about the inaction is that the expense isn't high. The companies that would be performing the upgrades would be able to offset the costs in normal rate changes. Here's Fry again.
It's not as difficult or as expensive to harden against as a lot of people imagine.
And Bob Hall agrees.
It is not going to be very expensive to provide the basic protection that's needed. And they can apply for a rate change to accommodate to the improvements.
Texans want energy to be affordable, but what good is affordable energy if it's zapped by an EMP or a cyber attack? Cheap energy that's not online is worthless. Besides, as we've already discussed, Texas can save money by moving away from unreliable green energy and back to dispatchable options. Aside from inaction in the Texas House, there's another culprit for why the grid isn't already protected. Here's Peter Pry discussing one of the main obstacles to hardening the grid.
We shouldn't let the utilities do it because they don't know anything about it. They pretend they do, but that's just because they want to regulate themselves and they don't want outsiders coming in and getting involved. The hardest thing to overcome is not the technology, money of EMP hardening, it's the politics of EMP. Because the electric utilities have so much clout, they've been successfully resisting, efforts to get them to protect themselves.
An attack on our grid could come from any one of our adversaries in the form of an EMP. However, there is one rival who may have another trick up their sleeve. China is a key supplier of components for the Texas grid. Components it could sabotage at any moment.
We're in a position where they actually wouldn't even have to do an EMP attack. They could just send a signal to their transformers and turn them off. And Trump was going to stop that. But Biden reversed it.
Transformers, like other critical parts of infrastructure in the U.S., rely on parts from China. These parts could contain backdoors to allow China to monitor and turn off the lights at the right moment. Remember those cyber attacks by Russia on the Ukraine mentioned at the beginning of the episode? The plants and infrastructure in the Ukraine are well known to the Russians because they built them. There have been attempts in recent years to stop Chinese parts from making their way into America's infrastructure. Here's Senator Hall again.
When Trump was in office, he issued several executive orders for the federal government and the state to start doing something to protect themselves. And he did it late in his presidency, but immediately upon taking office, Biden canceled all those executive orders. One of them was to stop buying transformers from China.
Chinese components aren't only in transformers used to transport power across the state. They're also in energy generating equipment. Kyle Bass, a member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, a group that tracks and reports on the dangers that China poses to the U.S., explains the problem this way.
And then the reliance on China just makes it infinitely worse. Because when you think about the components within the windmills or the solar panels, in the solar panels, there are computer chips. Right? If someone wants to inhibit the flow, they can actually do it. If they can get to those chips. Well, who do you think is providing those chips for those solar panels? The bad guys. Sure. Allowing that kind of asymmetrical power to be held by someone that is certainly an adversary to our country is just plain stupid.
Cyber warfare, an EMP, or rigged components are all ways the grid is vulnerable to electronic means of attack. But the grid could also be hit physically, on the ground. It's well documented that, for the past 3 years, our southern border has been porous. Millions of illegal aliens have entered the U.S. Included in those hordes are known terrorists.
Tonight, an alarming development in the border crisis. Among the record number of migrants crossing the southern border was a member of an Afghan terror organization.
Could invaders launch a coordinated physical attack on our grid? Not only could such an attack happen, but the number of targets they'd need to hit is shockingly small. Now, we'll hear from Kyle Bass and John Wellinghoff, the former head of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
When you talk about the fragility of our grid, for example, there are 16 or 17 substations that if compromised, our whole grid goes down. Right. And compromise could be done physically pretty easily.
There's a very few number of substations you need to take out in the entire United States to knock out the entire grid.
If your initial instinct is to dismiss a coordinated physical attack as a long shot, don't. It's happened before. On the morning of April 16th, 2013, a team of gunmen opened fire on the Metcalf transmission substation in California, severely damaging 17 transformers.
And an update on a story we brought you yesterday. A top former energy official claims an attack on an American power grid was terrorism. One or more snipers opened fire in April, knocking out 17 transformers that send power to California's Silicon Valley.
Military experts informed the former chairman of FERC that the assault looked like a professional job, noting that no fingerprints were discovered on the empty casings. Here's Congressman Henry Waxman during a committee hearing.
Installations simply cannot function without electricity. Yet it is clear that the electric grid is not adequately protected from physical or cyber attacks. And these are not theoretical concerns. Just this April, there was an actual attack on our electricity infrastructure. This was an unprecedented and sophisticated attack on an electric grid substation, using military-style weapons for the attack. Communications were disrupted. The attack inflicted substantial damage. It took weeks to replace damaged parts. Under slightly different conditions, there could have been a serious power outage or worse.
The perpetrators were never found. In episode 2 of this series, we highlighted how Democrats, including Congressman Mark Vesey, worked to undermine the Trump administration's attempt to bolster reliable energy production. Vesey also made the following statement during the same hearing.
Our utilities, states, and researchers do the hard work of hardening our energy infrastructure to cybersecurity threats and national disasters.
Yet the grid nationally and in Texas isn't hardened to any of these issues. And it's time to ensure its safety, as at this point, time can be considered borrowed. Protecting against EMP attacks and removing Chinese components from our infrastructure are areas where lawmakers have failed to take action. In 2021, Texas lawmakers were forced to act after it was widely reported that a Chinese general had bought land near an Air Force base in South Texas. Here's Kyle Bass explaining why that is concerning.
So today, a Chinese general still plugs directly into ERCOT to this very day. I think that's a bad idea. I think that's a risk. I think we should have laws against that.
During the 2023 legislative session, Texas lawmakers passed legislation intended to deal with the issue of adversarial foreign nationals owning Texas land. But those measures are difficult to enforce and underestimate the lengths our enemies will go to advance their surveillance aims.
Go listen to FBI Director Wray's testimony in the last 6 months. Every time he's been sitting in Congress, you say potentially, they've got it. They've embedded themselves in our infrastructure. And we know it. We've had hearings on it. The head law enforcement officer in the United States is telling you that they're embedded in our critical infrastructure systems. We need to build redundancies, and we need to not be stupid in the architecture of our systems. And hopefully our leadership, our governor, and then our leadership more broadly nationally will actually start acting like that.
In the next and final episode, we'll detail how our number one enemy has positioned themselves in our backyard to hurl us into darkness. Thank you for listening to this episode of Exposed. We'd like to thank Senator Bob Hall and Kyle Bass for participating in the interviews featured in this podcast. For more information on this topic and the others facing the state of Texas, please visit texasscorecard.com.
Exposed is a product of Texas Scorecard, the leading source on government and culture in Texas. For more information, go to texasscorecard.com.